This past Sunday, we received the sad news that a good friend and wonderful colleague, Neil Jampolis, passed away. It's been a tough week, and it's taken a few days to truly process this. Neil was very close to me and many of my colleagues in the business, and it's been really, really hard. But we decided on Monday that the best way to honor and pay tribute to Neil is to rebroadcast the interview we did last year. It was episode 56, titled Mutant Beavers, and it really shows Neil the way he was, a wonderful, humorous man with joy in his heart and a great, great artist and colleague. So sit back and enjoy listening to a great artist, a great human being, a great teacher, and a wonderful friend, Neil Peter Jampolis.
Light Talk. Lumen Brothers. Light Talk. Light Talk. Light Talk. Lumen Brothers. Light Talk.
Hello and welcome to Light Talk. This is Stan, and I'm broadcasting today from my state-of-the-art studio in the swamps of Gainesville, Florida.
Hi, this is Steve in Dallas, Texas.
And this is David, broadcasting from the beautiful Belmont Shore neighborhood in Long Beach, California. And we are the Lumen Brothers.
Plus one.
Hey, yes, plus one. Neil's here with us.
That's
anyway,
right.
we welcome to Light Talk one of my dearest and most influential mentors, Neil Peter Jampolis. I met Neil many years ago in 1980, if I remember correctly. And he was the one responsible for giving me my very first job in the theater. Him and Gilbert. Yeah, I remember that. It was in New York at the League Show. And so he's the blame. So everyone who doesn't like work with me, please send letters to Neil. Anyway, but Neil is like a very, very, very prominent and respected designer. He's done many shows. And Stan, why don't you tell our listeners a few highlights about his illustrious career?
I'm going to try and get through this, so hold on to your hats, everybody. Here we go. So Neil has been working professionally as a scenic lighting and costume designer since 1966. Since 1992, he's been a professor of theater at UCLA, teaching scenic and lighting design and directing. He's done more than 36, that's 36 plus Broadway productions, and at least that number of off-Broadway shows, as well as designing dance and directing and designing operas. Some of his most notable shows include his Tony-winning lighting for the Royal Shakespeare Company's Sherlock Holmes, Borsch Belt, which was his first Broadway show, and the winner of the Tony for Best Play, Lily Tomlin's The Search for Signs of Intelligent Life, the musical Black and Blue, another Tony nomination, designed with his wife, Jane Reisman, I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change, and 4 of the infamous Jackie Mason's Broadway shows. Neil also designed the perennial off-Broadway production of Forever Plaid, which I did once too, and has toured all over the world. Among the directors he's worked for are Harold Pinter, Sir Peter Hall, Sir Jonathan Miller, and Tennessee Williams.
Who?
His opera, yeah, we've heard of him, right?
Who are these hacks?
I've heard of these people. He's kind of a little famous. I'm getting goosebumps. His opera work includes the Metropolitan Opera's Macbeth in 1973 and Iphigenia on Tauride in 2007, the premiere and European productions of Lenny Bernstein's opera A Quiet Place, Magic Flute, co-designed with Maurice Sendak, and 10 productions for the Santa Fe Opera when he was just the babe in his 20s. Imagine that. He has been principal lighting designer for the dance company Palabolis, who I particularly adore, since 1975, and designs dance throughout the world. With all of that behind him, it could be that Neil's just a little tired. No, come on. Not really. Welcome to the show, Neil.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you here. Before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about that show you hired me for back in 1980. I'll just tell you a quick story. I was at the League show, and on that committee, I'm trying to remember. It was Neil, it was Ken, it was
Jane was on it too.
Jane was there. Lee Watson was there, and of course Gilbert Hemsley. And after you guys were like looking at my work, and you sat me down, and Gilbert asked, "What are you doing next year?" So I'm going to New York, and he said, "No, you're not." I said, "What?" He goes, "No, you're coming down to Miami. You're going to be the resident designer at the Miami Opera because Neil, Ken, and I are doing shows there, and we like your work, and we think you'd be good." And then Neil turns to me and says, "What are you doing next week?" and I said, "Well, I'm going back to school because he goes, "No, you're not." He goes, "You're coming to Caracas, Venezuela with me to do you remember the name of the show, Neil?"
Bolivar.
Yes.
Bolivar.
Bolivar. And it was a show bigger than God. And and I will never forget, I was responsible for the Panis projectors. And I'll never forget, and I asked Neil, I said, "So are we shipping these over?" He goes, "No, you're going to be checking them as extra baggage." And I actually had...
I know how big those are.
I would
That's
never
funny.
forget going at Miami International Airport, going to the Viasa counter, and with about 7 crates of projectors and 6'3" cable.
Oh, wow.
And checking them in as extra luggage. So,
wow.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about that show, Neil?
Well, it was a biographical opera of Bolivar, and they were very keen to produce it. And after they signed the contracts and I had designed it, Venezuela went more or less bankrupt. Their currency was devalued by 90%.
Wow.
So they didn't have the money, so they went to the government, who opened an account in New York for me to draw on. And I had to pay everybody in cash because everything was being built in New York, and the Panis were there and all the rest. And so I got everything paid. The whole production was done with projections on a gray structural set, and it included the earthquake that collapsed Venezuela at one point, and pictures of his ranch in the countryside and all of that. It was quite romantic. And on the front curtain, which was a scrim, there was a big, the famous etching of the face of Bolivar, who is, of course, a secular saint in Venezuela. He's from Caracas and the liberator of South America. So when the audience would come in, there was his face projected on the curtain. And just before we started...
I'm sorry, I remember this.
a fly crawled into the gate of the projector.
Oh, you're kidding.
And so this gigantic fly was walking across the face of Bolivar.
Up his nose.
On his nose, right. And there's David up in the booth trying to figure out how to get the fly out of the gate before it died on his nose.
Oh, that is too funny.
It was classic. It was truly classic.
I could just picture
It really
that.
was classic.
Oh, wow.
And we were waiting on the opening night, and the house was empty. We couldn't figure out where all the people were, since they told us the run was sold out. So 5 minutes before we were to start, and the house still empty, the President of the Republic and about 50 of his closest friends came in and sat in the middle of the orchestra, and that was the audience for first performance.
Right. And Neil turned to me and said, "Whatever you do, do not laugh."
Oh, wow.
That's right.
Because there were also at every entrance, if you remember, Neil, at every entrance
with guns.
was an officer with an AK-47.
That's
So-
right.
Oh, wow.
Anyway,
Guys
so
with guns and opera. Perfect combination.
Did it have a run after that night? Did it open
Yeah,
to the
yeah. It
public?
had five sold out performances after that.
yeah.
But the opening was the private performance.
So
That's
and so
Like-
the fly never came into the gate before that in rehearsals. He just showed up
Never.
for opening.
Never showed up for opening night. I guess it was a friend of the president.
Must
Yeah.
have been.
And I do remember that it was a profile of Simon Bolivar, and the
Yes.
fly actually crawled up his nose.
Oh.
He actually
Right,
went up
that's
his
right.
chin, up around, and then into the nose.
I can just picture that. That's so funny.
Oh, it was classic.
That is so funny.
Yeah, we didn't have cell phone cameras in those days. It would have been the perfect thing to take
That's
a
right.
picture
We
of.
wish it would have been great.
Yeah, I just wanted to
Right.
say in the 80s, I'm a New Yorker, and in the 80s, Neil was everywhere. Like every time you turned around, it was another Neil Peter Jampolis show. And so I am so, honored to be talking to you about your career, which leads me into the first question. So, you've had an extremely distinguished career as a theater artist. So tell us a little bit how you transitioned into scenography and then even beyond that into directing.
Well, as I was looking through my CV to put that bio together, I noticed that about the first 20 shows that I designed professionally, I designed the scenery. And all of the shows I did, or half of them that I did in Santa Fe, I wasn't the lighting designer for. I was designing scenery and on a couple of occasions, costumes. So I've always been a scenographer. I was educated as a scenic designer and who did his own lighting, which was not all that common at the time. But I loved doing lighting because that's what I did when I was a kid. And so I put them together. Oddly enough, I became a kind of lighting designer, but a lot of the shows that I lit on Broadway were imports from England, and they didn't bring the set. They would send the sketches and draftings, and I would put the whole thing together. I would go to the shops, I would get the bids, I would, work on that. So even though it said lighting by, I had also put it together and done the props, and in the case of 2 Broadway shows, done the costumes too. So I've sort of always been a scenographer. I had done that so long that most of the people outside of New York who hired me, whether it was in regional theater or opera companies or whatever, hired me to be the scenery and lighting designer. And occasionally the scenery, lighting, and costume designer. And then finally, the scenery, costume, and lighting designer and director, which makes for very small production meetings.
And you
how
said
did
you
it
were
happen?
educated as a stenographer. Where did you study?
I studied at the Goodman Theater in Chicago, back when it was in the Art Institute.
Right.
And I got my GE requirements done at the University of Chicago, where my major, which I had to have there, was in Jacobean theater.
That was a major.
And that was a major. Well, a major was English with a special, then I wanted to study Jacobean theater. And so so when I graduated, it was a joint BA, BFA degree from the Art Institute of Chicago.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was a perfect thing for a scenographer because I was surrounded by great art the whole time.
Yeah,
Definitely
right.
Chicago. Beautiful. Hey, so Neil, our next question is one of the greatest examples of manipulating the red-green theory that I've ever
Yes.
saw was your design of the first few minutes of Turandot, culminating with the entrance of the Moon Maidens. Could you please
Right.
tell our listeners how you use how we perceive color to enhance the audience's reaction to the music and the mood? The reason why I asked this question is because at this point, when I saw Neil do this, blew my mind and made me understand everything I needed to know about red and green.
You know, it's one of the shows that I've done where I can remember a cue.
Yes, I will never forget this cue.
And what it looked like, because it was so thrilling when we did it. And the opening minutes of Turandot is this kind of orgy of violence, and it just keeps building with a headsman grinding his axe on a grinding wheel, and the chorus calling for blood, and it just goes nuts. And all through the opening, we had a bunch of cues in which we started with a deep red, and then we added fire effects, and then we added more red, and then we added still more red until the entire stage was only lit in various shades of red and orange. And at the end of that first section, there's a phrase, bum, 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 great big chord from the orchestra, and it dissolves away into moonlight music. And so the cue was about 6 seconds long to go from all that red to blue. And it went to a deep blue right away in the back, not on the people, because I rarely do that. And it kind of moved forward through blues and blue-greens, and then finally a very pale blue-green diagonal wash of backlights in moonlight color, pale blue-green, to finish that section. And the change, the dissolve from red to blue, was startling. In that 6 seconds, you really, the red stayed in your eyes until you kind of blinked a few times, and then it was blue. Mm-hmm. And it was really, it was very strong. And I hasten to add, we did it on road boards.
Oh,
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Piano boards.
We only had piano boards at the time.
It was incredible.
So all that planning and all those moves had to be done with guys pushing handles at the right and with the right counts and the right overlapping and everything else. It was hard to construct, but worth it.
And if I remember correctly, we had a lot of salmoniac smoke.
Yes, we did. The good old those cones.
Can't do that today.
Yes.
What the
Those
piano boards?
cones, well, then there was a lot of it, because that's the way you did it.
So I have a question about that. I didn't see the cue, but David did. But I have a sort of a visual science question, Neil. So when you did that, did you know consciously that there was going to be this retinal delay effect as during the transition, or did you? Was that intuition and you tried it and you said, "Holy wow, that's really great"?
I would say the latter.
Okay.
I mean, of course, in studying, I realized it, and looking at those examples, of pictures in books with the red square and the green circle in the middle. I could sort of intuit it, but I'd never done it until that time.
I imagine you've used it over and over again since then. Not in that context, but as a technique.
Yeah, I mean, few operas give you the chance to do that. The only one I did was I designed the set and lighting for an opera called The Devil and Kate, which is a Dvorak opera, which the second of 3 acts takes place in hell, and it was lit only with red lights. Every light that was on had a red gel in it. And so you were sitting in red light for about a half an hour. And then when the act ended and the curtain came down, nobody could see a thing for about 3 minutes because all the red was all burned in,
Yeah.
So, Neil, this is Steve in Dallas. Clearly, you've worked on Broadway. You've worked off-Broadway. Let's talk about 2 of your biggest hits. Forever Plaid off-Broadway, and all of that work you did with Jackie Mason on Broadway.
Sure. Well, Forever Plaid was a wonderful experience. When I first saw it, it was upstairs at a nightclub in a very tiny production. And I didn't do anything on it. I just went to see it because the producer asked me. Then he said we were going to go and do a bigger production in Washington and then in a lot of other cities. And would I like to design the scenery and lighting? So I said, yeah, sure. But I have to go to Europe to do an opera right away. So I can do the set design for you. And how about have Jane do the lighting? Now, he knew both of us because we'd done a failed Broadway show that closed out of town for him, the producer, that is. And so I said to Jane, you're going to light this little show and I'm doing the set. And she said, really? Okay. How much money do we get? I said, we're going to split a $500 fee. So the deal I made with the producer was that we'll take the $500, but every other theater, for as long as you have the rights that you produce it in, we get to design the show. And that went on for about 12 years.
Nice.
And a lot of productions, until Jane became unable to go out on some of these gigs because she was ill for a while. And so I took over the lighting, but I always used her cues and her color. So that, and it always said lighting by Jane Reisman.
That's beautiful.
Nice.
How about Jackie?
Yeah, he's a funny guy.
It was on opening night of Lily Tomlin's show in Los Angeles after we left Broadway. And on opening night, and this man came up to me. I was, of course, in the back, and said, are you the lighting designer, the set designer for this show? I said, yeah. He said, I'm going to produce Jackie Mason on Broadway. Would you like to design it? I said, sure. Meanwhile, when I told Jane, she was not happy about it. But anyway, I said, sure, I'll do it. And it was his first Broadway show, that is the producer's, as well as Jackie's. And the producer wanted to make a name on Broadway. So he really wanted production values. And I designed 5 or 6 set changes for this show. And Jackie Mason spent the entire show in the first 6 feet and the middle 10 feet of the stage. That was his range. And behind him, sets were changing.
Oh, wow.
Grand pianos were moving in and out. Chandeliers were flying in and out. Unbelievable bunch of stuff. So I went to the general manager. I said, the nearest I can figure, this show is going to take 13 stagehands to run. And he said, well, it's not going to run more than 6 weeks, and that we have that much money. So, yeah, go ahead. So a year and a half later, after they'd spent over $1 million on stagehand fees, the show closed.
Wow.
But it probably made money, did it not, over time? Or did it lose?
It made a lot of money, and it made Jackie Mason a lot of money.
Yeah, sure.
And then he did 3 more Broadway shows, and I did all of them.
Wow.
I'm going to ask, so the next question is, tell us about the techniques you use when working with insane people. So was Mason insane or reasonable to work with? And what about the insane people?
He was reasonable to work with, but he was not reasonable to talk to. He was extremely self-involved and self-referential. Everything was about him. And he was extremely right-wing, which ain't my politics at all.
Right, wow.
And so we would never get very far on that because he would always want to start a conversation to bait me, and I wouldn't play along. But he had Rudy Giuliani come backstage once, and I had to show him around the set and all that kind of thing. Yeah. So, he was not the sanest of people.
You work with a lot of highly creative people, and sometimes they're maybe insane is not the right word, but techniques that you've developed to work with people who might not be the easiest to get along with.
That happens a lot in opera, I've found, did happen, because the egos are so huge.
The divas.
Yes, it's one of the reasons I started directing.
Yeah, right. That's what I told my students. They asked me, well, why did Neil start directing? I said, well, because I believe he just got tired of dealing with bad directors. He said, I'm going to just direct this myself.
It's exactly right. Exactly right.
Okay. So Neil, as one of your former assistants, I appreciate how well you train young lighting artists. Tell us about your philosophy of mentoring young theater designers.
Well, the first thing is identifying talented people to mentor. I wouldn't take someone who knew nothing, but I might take someone who was interested in theater, knew something about theater history, could have an intelligent conversation about it. And my mentoring would begin by giving them a job to do and letting them do it without coaching and then critiquing it. And that's still the way I teach as a graduate school teacher. Yes, of course, I teach classes where we cover some basics and techniques and things like dance and opera and whatever. But basically, I identify people that I would like to mentor, and I watch over them, and I act more as a coach than as a teacher.
Well, you are listening to Light Talk with the Lumen Brothers, and this week, Light Talk is sponsored by
the Masked Mutant. Are you working on a show that is guaranteed to end your career? Do you see your artistic integrity disappearing before your eyes? Do you anticipate serious suicidal tendencies once the New York Times reviews come out? Well, there is one way you can still save your career. Call the Masked Mutant to put an end to your suffering by closing that show early. The Masked Mutant will literally destroy that horrible show. One phone call and it's done. Hear those sirens in the night? An overwhelming feeling of well-being calms you as you know that those fire trucks are heading to that burning theater. The Masked Mutant also offers less destructive means of early closure. Try his patented stinky poo atmospheric treatment. One well-placed beaver coat, and your theater will be so funked up, they will need an army of hazmat specialists armed with industrial-strength cleaning solutions to make that theater habitable again. Sometimes the Masked Mutant makes a dramatic entrance. Watch and wonder as he rips open the RP screen to stop the rehearsal mid-production number. The Masked Mutant chases the frightened dancers off the stage as the creative team cheers him on. "Oh, Masked Mutant, please save us!" As he runs out of the theater, he turns and answers, "Don't worry, I will close your show long before it opens." Your assistant turns to you and asks, "Who was that masked man?" You answer, "That was the Masked Mutant. He has been saving theatrical careers for decades." The Masked Mutant. It's good to know that he is there when you need him. Easy payment options accepted. So, Neil, please reveal the identity of the Masked Mutant.
The Masked Mutant was actually a chorus of masked mutants that came on in the climactic scene of an opera called Minutes to Midnight, which may be the worst opera I've ever worked on.
Absolutely.
And David worked on it too. But I was merely the costume designer and had to create the Masked Mutant costumes.
Yes.
They were really called Masked Mutants, but that's the title of the chorus?
No, they were supposed to be what existed after the nuclear blast.
Okay.
And so it was a chorus of dancers in painted spandex tights and tops and wearing masks built on fencing masks. So that they had these large,
no faces, right?
But with no faces on them.
Interesting.
And they did a ballet, and that was it.
Right, and this was a particularly painful 13-minute ballet. And one night, Neil's sitting behind me laughing, because I was trying to light this thing with Schneider Simpson. Remember that? And Neil was saying, "It's time for the entrance of the Masked Mutant." And that is me coming from behind the screen, tearing it open with a knife, and putting an end to this horrible ballet. But anyway, yeah, that was absolutely the worst opera ever.
David was suffering all through the rehearsals because Schneider Simpson was making life miserable for him. He was the was he the director? No, he was the set designer. Yeah. He was the scenic designer. And he was having the terrible, everything he did, Schneider Simpson was critiquing. And then finally we came to the first dress rehearsal, and we got all the way through it. And I walked over to the desk, and Schneider Simpson turned to me and said, "Nice clothes." And that was it. And David, behind his back, is making a fist, and "I'll get you."
I get you, damn it. Jampolis.
And now, back to Light Talk.
So before we continue with our listener questions, Neil has something to add to last week's discussion on the cost of graduate school. As you know, Neil is the head of design at UCLA. So Neil, what do you want to add?
I wanted to add that listening to the show, I wondered what universe Steve and Stan were living in when they quoted what seemed to be absurdly low costs for going to graduate school. They sure aren't low in my neck of the woods. They're punishing. And worse than that, there's no funding for the students. Or what funding there is not regular, let's say. Some years we have it, some years we don't, and some years our recruiting fails altogether because there's not enough money to pay the students for them to come. Because when they get here, they'll be TAing, teaching assistant, which means they'll be wrangling undergraduates, putting on shows, and working as very close to forced labor, it seems to me. Meanwhile, their costs of tuition and expenses and all the rest just go up terribly. So it would be wonderful to think that people could get through graduate school as cheaply as you guys say, but I suppose if your schools can offer full rides to students, sure, that's fine. I have to say the state of California doesn't permit that in state institutions.
It could be, Neil, that California is a different universe. I don't know.
All right. Well, I think it probably is.
Yeah, maybe so. I just to repeat, I'm amazed. We've had up and downs as well, but we've even toyed with the idea of having students come that were not on tuition waivers and assistantships, and we thought we'd be creating two classes of citizens, and they really wouldn't be able to be. It would be different if they just came to school and went home. But right now we're offering $18,000 for 9 months.
Wow!
With a tuition waiver. They pay about $1,000 a semester in fees. And then we offer scholarships at the end of the year, which offsets quite a bit of that if they're good students. So, I think we're just particularly lucky, perhaps. I don't know what it is across the board.
I think you are. I was looking at the websites of some of the East Coast, Northeast Coast institutions, and their quoted prices are $56,000, $57,000, $48,000. $65,000 a year for graduate school. And sure, there probably would be offsets, but they'd have to be very big offsets. So, I think your students are lucky to go to school in schools that have money to give them. But one of the things about working for that money is that they're often totally burned out between doing their own shows, doing the work scholarship things, and taking classes.
And I think a lot of it has to do also, and it's something I was trying to make clear last week, is that these are different universes, that, private universities, research universities in different states. It's a different universe than what's happening in California in the state schools. My students they get very little money. The tuition's low. It's only like $8,000 a year, but the only amount we can offer them is a work study that barely pays that. Plus, trying to live in California is very difficult, So I was talking to my students were kind of pissed off this morning, actually, because they said, "Hey, why didn't you talk about the state schools?" One of my students is going to graduate with about $100,000 in debt, and it's because she's had to live. She has to pay, money to live. She's been here 3 years. It's expensive, $25,000, $30,000 a year. It's not easy.
Horrible.
Yeah, it's very challenging. And it's basically creating two classes of graduate schools. And I'm afraid that the one class that Neil and I belong to may not be around for much longer if this continues.
No, it may not. I mean, our undergraduate classes, in theater, you have to beat them off with a stick. Mm-hmm. And particularly musical theater, if you're one of the 100 people who get the 15 places, you're going to work.
Yeah, right.
Because the training is so great.
So good.
They
yeah.
go right to Broadway or right into, the studios or something. It's worth the money for an undergraduate, especially a California resident undergraduate. But graduate school is another animal.
Speaking of education, I've got the next question, which is to ask you, what do you see missing in current either graduate or undergraduate education that you think, those of us who are doing this, are we missing anything, or what should we be doing more of?
I don't think you, as the teachers of design and lighting, are missing anything. I think the students are missing something because they come to us without an education that I can discern.
Or history, or knowledge of history, really.
Well, that's it. They've got a degree. They have no knowledge of history or of literature.
Mm-hmm. Or even anything that happened before their parents were born.
Right. And they don't seem, in a funny way, to have an interest in it.
True.
When I was a kid in the 50s and the 40s even, I was looking at picture books about the silent movies, and I was fascinated with those. And then I always loved the theater and followed it. And the first page I read on Sunday in the New York Times was the theater section.
Right, me too, yeah.
So it's something I loved. People come here without a love of the theater. They loved the high school musical they were in, or lit. But they don't seem to know much more of that.
Steve has made the point in the past, and I think he hits on something really good, is curiosity.
Well, that's it.
It's just innate curiosity about the world.
It's true. I had a teacher, I think it was when I was in school, and it was, I was talking about how tough it was to go to the University of Chicago and an art school at the same time, more or less. And he said, in slightly different words, he said, if all you know is theater, then you don't know theater.
Right. That's good.
And, I say that to my students. It's a watchword with me. What are you going to bring
to the table,
to the theater, if you have no history, if you have no depth, if you have no curiosity, if you don't read,
right?
If you don't watch films that date before Star Wars, the fourth revival. I just, sure, you're not as old as I am, and I have a longer history, but your history doesn't seem to be as old as you are.
No, it's true. We've tried to supplement that. We were so shocked. In the past couple of years, we've been so shocked names, that they should
Right.
know. So we, in our design studio now, we have infused it with design history. Who are the seminal names? Do you know who Appia is? They look at you.
Right.
Who? How did you
Yeah,
get here?
I agree. 1/4 of my 9 quarters of graduate lighting is we read 10 plays in 10 weeks and talk about them. There's a Greek play, a Jacobean play, a Shakespeare play to see the difference between the two. And then I start with one 19th century play, usually a European, Ibsen or someone. And then I start with Pulitzer Prize winning plays from the U.S. O'Neill, plays from the 50s, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, and up to maybe someone like Susan Laurie Parks, but which they all seem to know.
Is that because
So
they haven't read plays in their undergraduate program?
That's exactly what it is.
Wow.
Neil, it's Steve in Dallas again. Just about everyone who knows you knows your name and your wife's name, Jane Reisman. You guys were amazing together as artists and a loving married couple. How did you two manage to have such a successful life?
Well, because we knew everything about what the other was doing. There were no mysteries, and I didn't tell Jane not to critique my work. Rather, I would ask her opinion, and she would do the same for me. And I was a better draftsman. This is before Vectorworks. I was a better draftsman than she was, and so I would draft her shows, and she would double check the hookup on mine and make sure that everything was right. And so we had that going. Then we would assist each other in the theater. We would be each other's assistants, and that would save money. But also, it was great, At one point, I had a stagehand say, "Can I talk to you on the side here?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I have a question. How do you let your assistant talk to you like that?"
You had no choice.
I said, "We go home together every night." So I had no choice.
Yes,
exactly.
dear. Yes,
Right.
dear.
And part of the other thing was that we both were very busy and traveling all the time. And we used to say in the first 10 years of our marriage, we were married for 5. We were just apart so often that when we came back together, it was that much better.
That's fantastic.
Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Yeah.
We brought this up because one of my students asked me, "Is it possible?" Because they know about your history, they know about Jane, and they said, they were married for so long, and was there any sort of competition, jealousy, artistic jealousy, and and I said, no, you had to know Neil and Jane, and it was a beautiful thing, it really was.
Jane passed in December, just this last December, and we were together for 50 years altogether.
Oh, God bless. 50 years.
Yeah.
Did she love Porsches as much as you did?
No, I'll tell you, she had a job. I had the Porsche in New York, and while we were still living in New York, she got a job for 2 years teaching in Bennington, at Bennington College, which, if listeners don't know, is in Vermont.
Vermont, yeah.
And about a 5 or 6 hour drive from New York.
Right.
She would make it in 3. She would take the Porsche. She was always telling me to slow down. She would take the Porsche and go up the New York Thruway at 100 miles an hour to get there. But she had no idea she was driving that fast because that's what Porsches are like.
Yeah. What model did you guys have?
That was a 911S.
Yeah. Sweet.
Yeah, I have a question, Neil. The Porsche you have now, what's it 0 to 60 time?
4.5 seconds, I think.
Nice. What model are you driving now, Neil?
I'm driving a Boxster,
Yeah.
an all black edition Boxster.
Yeah.
So all the trim and everything is black.
it.
It's like the Batmobile.
I almost bought a
it's
Boxster, but I
very
ended up with
sexy
an
car.
S2000. I did. I was between those two cars. But the real question is, do you ever drive it when it's cool in LA with the beaver coat in the Boxster with the top down? That's the image that I have of you.
It hasn't been that cold yet.
Never that cold in LA.
Right. And the Boxster has heated seats.
That's true. It does.
So I don't worry about
But I think that's the look. The look of that car with Neil with the sunglasses on and the beaver coat, doing 80 up the the 405 or something. That's what I want to see.
And my black baseball cap that says Brooklyn on it.
There we go. All right. There we go.
You wear that in Dodgerland? Oh my God.
We're still crying in Brooklyn about losing the Dodgers.
They were the Brooklyn Dodgers before they got here.
I know.
Ebbets Field, man.
Kind of pissed. That's great.
Yes.
Well, I'm
I'm
going to push us into the future to kind of sign us off. A last question.
Okay.
So,
Yeah.
because you've been around a couple of times, and I remember, Neil, in the 80s, like in all the Theater Crafts magazines, there was a picture of you, and Roscoe was saying, a light is just a light without a gobo, and Neil Peter Jampolis, and this gobo and that gobo, and so the question is, look into your crystal ball and tell us, what do you think is the next game-changing lighting technology, and how will it change the way we create art, or will it at all?
The technique of getting there will certainly change with the new equipment and all of the rest of that. It'll make it easier to do things. But whether those things will advance the show is a big question for me.
Yeah.
I don't do flash and trash, razzle dazzle,
Right.
because I don't think it means anything. But anything that would get me to make a more beautiful cue and move to the next cue in a beautiful, subtle way, I appreciate. And one of the problems with all of the possibilities is that because designers now can do anything, they do anything.
That's the problem, right?
And they fill the stage with meaningless things just because they're fun to create and they think they look pretty. But, I would rather, I don't go as far as saying you shouldn't notice the lights. That used to be the dictum.
Yeah.
But I think that everybody owes the audience a show from whatever direction they're coming from. And so if you can make it beautiful and beautiful enough that people say, wow, that lighting was beautiful, then I think that's great. I have no quarrel with it. But invisible lighting, that whole dictum, I think, came from the period when lighting was terrible.
Right.
And if you could see the lighting, it was because it was awful.
Right.
And so, don't do anything that people can see and criticize or that ruins the show. There's a review of the original Morning Becomes Electra written by Stark Young, wrote the review. This is whenever that play was, in the 20s. And he said, the set by Robert Edmond Jones was very pleasing, but there was a disturbing yellow light that kept hitting the side of the house. In the review in the New York Times.
Yeah, that's a sad commentary on the lighting.
So, of course, if he could have lit the show without anybody seeing that yellow light, he'd have been a happier man. But there weren't any ellipsoidals in those days.
Right.
So you had to take your chances. And if the barn door swung open a little bit, you were sunk.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now we have remote-controlled shutters. Who would have ever thunk it?
I know. We have all of that, and it makes it very easy. And I'm an old guy. I can just sit in my seat in the middle of the house and do stuff.
Yeah.
I don't have to run up on stage and stand there with my arms out or my arms up or turn around and look into the lights.
Yeah.
I send somebody up, stand there, and the light gets moved and shuttered and colored, and I'm a happy guy.
It's a beautiful thing. It really
Well,
is.
from a guy who did a lot of running for you, Neil, up on stage, like, David, tell him to do that. I must thank you so much for being with us today. This has been a total blast.
Awesome.
It was great, and we've wanted to get you on the show for a long time, and I'm glad that you found the time to join us. So thanks, Neil. Hey guys, that Hammond organ solo tells us once again that you've spent a precious 51 minutes listening to Light Talk. You can listen to Light Talk every week on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, SoundCloud, and Spotify. And don't forget to join Light Talk on Facebook so that you can post your questions and comments and subscribe on iTunes.
No guarantee is offered regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on this podcast.
In other words, when working in your theater, wear the safety equipment. Hard hats, everybody.
Light Talk is written and produced by the Lumen Brothers, coming to you from Long Beach, Gainesville, and the Lone Star State.
And be sure to tune in next week when we discuss, how do I know if a bulb is about to die? I need some help choosing a new console for my school. What is the best material for a psych? And why do Americans always vary about size? My hands! Oh, I said that plastic.
All that and a new sponsor, Light Talk, broadcasting questionable Lumen knowledge and humor around the world.
We will see you all next Saturday morning. Bye-bye from Light Talk. Bye,
Bye-bye,
Neil.
everybody. Thank you, Neil Peter.
Goodbye. Good night.
Light Talk.